Okay, this is actually really cool. I I kind of hope that in future batches it does the same thing, because it is a really cool effect. Okay, so I am out in the garage right now and I wanted to check on that purple yarn that we were trying to recreate yesterday. Okay, so I'm gonna pull it out of the spinner and we'll compare it to this photo that I'm gonna pop up on the screen here. And I'm gonna try and make this as easy for you to see as I can. So here is, let's see, the lighting is not the greatest, so I'm gonna turn the camera this way to try to get the best lighting. Okay, so here is what I have. Of course, it's a little bit, I think what you're seeing on the screen, I mean, it's pretty close, but I feel like what you're seeing on the screen, it looks more blue than what I'm holding in my hand. But I think we're getting close. I'm gonna call it for this shop update because it is so darn close. And like I said, I think what you're seeing, oops, sorry. I think what you're seeing in that sunlight looked more blue, but actually, yeah, if I hold it up here and compare it to the photo, move my face out of the frame, this is much more accurate what you're seeing here. So yeah, I think we are on to something here. I'm really happy with this. This is the BFL DK base, but you know, strangely enough, and I used the same recipe for each pan that I did, obviously, but for whatever reason, the 4-ply, my merino nylon 4-ply that you're gonna see here in just a second, I'm gonna make it so it's a little bit easier for you to see, is much more purple, like just bright, straight up bright purple. I don't know, maybe not. Maybe it does look pretty similar. I haven't taken this one out of the water yet to really compare. Actually, you know what I'm gonna do, because it's deceiving when it's wet. I'm gonna go ahead and pull out one of the skeins, dry it in the spin dryer, and then we're gonna see if it is actually pretty similar to the BFL that I just showed you, because yeah, it's just kind of deceiving when it's in the water. So I'm gonna take this over really quickly to the spin dryer, dripping some water along the way. I'm gonna close the lid on that sucker. Let's see, sometimes this thing freaks out when you only put one thing in there, but if you can hold it down, it'll sort itself out. And we're off to the races. Okay, so let's go ahead and see, after that's all done spinning, if it comes out any closer to that BFL. Okay, so I'm pulling out the merino nylon. And yeah, I mean, okay, this is really strange because the yarn is a different composition, that is for sure. So this is 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon, whereas the other skein is 100% superwash blue face luster wool, so there's no nylon in this. So that could have something to do with why the color is different, but to me it's different in a weird way. It's almost like this has like a stream of purple running through it, whereas the BFL is just like a solid purple. This has like an undertone of like a brighter purple. I think what I'm trying to say is that the BFL has more of a gray undertone. So here they are together. This is the 75-25 and this is the 100% BFL. And you can tell that this one is definitely more of a gray, whereas this one has more of like a purple undertone to it. Or almost actually like, kind of like a fuchsia undertone, really. I think, I do think I'm gonna call it though, because it is close. Whenever I put listings in the shop, I always take pictures of each listing on separate bases because there inevitably is differences across bases. But yeah, so I'm just gonna call it because it's beautiful. Whatever it is, it's beautiful. So I'm not worried about that. But it is an interesting difference. I have a few different bases over there, and actually I'll go ahead and show you the difference if there is any more difference on the other bases, because I haven't pulled those out of the water yet. So I'm gonna get some of those, dry each one from each separate base, and we'll see if there is a noticeable difference even across those bases. Okay, so this is interesting, and I have a theory as to why we're seeing this brighter purple in this 75-25 as opposed to the BFL, but then also that theory, I've developed that based on seeing the super bulky that I offer. Now my super bulky is 100% non-superwash Peruvian Highland wool, and so it is gonna take dye differently, obviously, just because of the composition and the fact that it's not super washed. But this is interesting. So sometimes when I'm developing a solid color, I will start with what I think is the color. Mix the dye, put it in the pan, put the yarn in there, and then I'll get like an initial, I don't know, kind of idea of what it's gonna do. And then based on that, I'll either add more of a particular dye or tone it up, tone it down, whatever. But you can't go less. Like, all you can do at that point is say, okay, this is darker than I was hoping for, and then you just reduce the dye down on the next batch, because that batch at that point you can't remove dye. In this case, with this color, I did, after I did the initial dye, I realized that I wanted to tone it down more. And so I added some more dye to tone the color down, to give it more of a gray undertone. I lifted the yarn out of the pan, added the dye, stirred it around, added the yarn back. But when you do that, even if the dye is mixed in the pan, the different colors of dye are going to adhere to the yarn at different times. And in the case of non-superwash yarn, especially something as bulky as this, you can see that happening on the yarn when it's all finished and fully exhausted. And all of those yarns over there are fully exhausted. The water is 100% clear. So this is interesting. You can see here on the yarn, I hope you can, it might be harder for you to see, I'm looking at it on the screen and it looks like you can kind of see it, but there's like swaths of that gray kind of undertone running through the yarn in addition to that purple. So it almost is like it didn't blend 100% because you're getting two tones happening here. You can see the darker here and the lighter here. Now what I'm thinking is happening on this one over here is something very similar, but on a much finer gauge. So this is a much lighter weight yarn, and this is a much heavier weight yarn. You can see that variegation much easier on this heavier weight yarn. You can see the brighter pops of purple and the darker gray areas here, whereas on this lighter weight yarn, you're really just getting really bright pops of purple. There are these strands of yarn that have that deeper gray, but because the yarn is so fine, it's almost like that brighter purple, which is more present, is taking precedent in the way that the yarn looks. So I think that maybe what happened there, and the reason why we're not noticing it as much with this Blueface Luster yarn, and I've mentioned this in the past as well, this yarn has a much higher lanolin percentage, and that can make it harder for dye to adhere to the yarn, but in the case of solids can actually help dye adhere to the yarn more evenly because it doesn't adhere so quickly. And I think maybe that's why we're noticing a much more even toning happening with this yarn. So these are my initial kind of takes on the situation, considering, you know, what I know about these different yarn bases. And it's really interesting. And so what that tells me is that next time I go to dye this color, I will at that point know how much of that toning dye that I want to add, and I'll add it all at once, as opposed to adding it after the yarn has been added to the pan, like pulling the yarn out, adding more, and then putting the yarn back in. Because, you know, it does help to give you that final color that you're looking for, but this kind of thing will happen, and it's beautiful still. Like this bulky yarn with that gray swath of color running through, it's really gorgeous. So I'm okay with that. I'm happy with that. This is a prototype batch of the color. I always list these as prototype batches in my shop, but moving forward, when I go to dye the color, I will know how much of every dye to use and what percentage to achieve what we ultimately want to be this color right here, which is on the BFL yarn. So I'm confident that that will be the case for the future batches. But in the case of this initial prototype batch, this is what we get, and it's beautiful, thankfully, and it's really stinking close to that color of the Lucky Strike that I was going for here. So I'm gonna go ahead, I have one more actually 2 more bases that I dyed this on that I want to check out. I have an Eco Wool, which is a new base in the shop. It's 50% recycled wool and 50% Tencel. And Tencel is a plant-based fiber, a cellulose-based fiber, so it's going to give us a similar, it doesn't take acid dye because it's a plant-based fiber, so that part of the yarn is not going to take the color like the wool portion of the yarn, so we're going to see maybe a similar reaction or a similar adherence to the yarn as we are seeing in the 75-25. Of course, maybe different because the cellulose fiber is 50% of the yarn, so what have you. Let's check it out. I have also a 100% superwash merino Aran weight that we're going to check and see. But yeah, this is kind of fun. It's like science. Okay, this is actually really cool. I kind of hope that in future batches it does the same thing, because it is a really cool effect to the yarn. I'm getting that beautiful smoky purple that I want from that Lucky Strike color that I'm trying to recreate, but I'm also getting some really cool depth and dimension because of the way that the dye adheres to the yarn and the stages at which the dye adheres to the yarn, because it doesn't adhere at the same time. So that's kind of what, like, ultimately I'm learning through this. And I know this about doing solid colors. When you're mixing dyes together, there are different rates at which each dye will adhere to the yarn, giving you really beautiful depth. That's why whenever I dye yarn solid colors, I never use a single dye, because though it's beautiful, there's some beautiful dyes that you could just pop in the pan as is and have it be beautiful. But I love dimension, I love depth, I love the variance that you can get even in a solid color by mixing different dyes, and that's because the dyes are adhering to the yarn at different rates. And so that is essentially what's happening here that's making this so interesting, and so I really love it. Okay, here is the 100% superwash merino Aran weight yarn, and I'll compare it to that initial blue face luster yarn as well, but I'm going to show it to you by itself. Now again, these are still kind of damp. Well, I mean, they're pretty significantly damp because I just pulled them out of the dryer, or the spin dryer. So there it is. Still a beautiful smoky purple color. It's going to lighten up a bit when it continues to dry, which also may have an impact on my future batches of this if I think that I want it to be a little bit richer or deeper. But for this initial batch, it's going to be beautiful. So there is that superwash merino, and in here is the comparison to the BFL. I know this isn't the greatest lighting. It's kind of an, you know, it's shady in the garage, but you can kind of get the gist of the difference. This does have more pops of that bright purple. This has more of that deep, smoky kind of look to it, but interesting. Now, what's really cool is this Eco Wool yarn that I was telling you about. Like I said, it is 50% recycled wool, untreated, recycled wool from various different sources, and then 50% Tencel, which, like I mentioned, is a cellulose fiber that originates as tree pulp. So they use tree pulp and you know, develop fiber that is just as strong, and in some cases stronger than nylon, but it's a natural alternative to nylon, so that's really cool about it. But it gives the yarn this beautiful luster because the Tencel doesn't take the dye. So it's naturally going to be lighter than these other colors because there's less fiber taking the dye. Or I guess you could look at it like this. The wool portion of the fiber is taking the dye. The Tencel portion of the fiber is not. And so that strand of Tencel running through the yarn reflects light back to you, making it appear lighter and also giving it a really beautiful shine. So here is what I'm talking about. So this is the Eco Wool. You can see that fiber, that lustrous Tencel fiber running through there that is almost like, it kind of reminds you of a silver stellina if you're familiar with yarn like that. It's a natural sparkle. I'm not a huge fan of stellina. I used to use it a lot, in gold stellina was my favorite. But over time I just stopped using it, fell out of love with it, but ever since I discovered dyeing with Tencel, it's like even better because it's a natural shine and luster running through your fiber. It's giving it strength, it's adding, you know, character to the yarn, and I love that so much. So I'm very excited, number one, about this yarn, and number two, about this color on this yarn, because this is beautiful. Yeah, just like, you guys, how gorgeous is that? So here is that compared to Let's just compare it to the Merino Nylon, which is our bright color. There you go. Yeah, I don't know, this one just really, for whatever reason, it's just much more purple. I may list this one as a misfit, I'm not sure, but yeah, super, super pretty. Can't wait to see these dry. I'm gonna go ahead and pull out the rest of all the yarn, get it spun, and then I've got another solid that I need to do. I'm doing my leather colorway, and then, and I have been like mulling around changing the name of that colorway. It's this beautiful, kind of rich, I don't know, what would you describe? Actually, what I'm trying to say is that I want to change the name of the colorway from leather to whiskey in the jar, which is a really cool, like kind of Irish folk song. And I actually don't even know if it's called whiskey in the jar. It might be called something else. I was listening to some traditional Irish music and that song came on, and I was thinking like, that's a great name for that color because it does look like a deep amber whiskey almost, which is, the color is also reminiscent of leather, so I can keep it as is, whatever. But these are the things I think about. Okay, so I'm gonna get those out, dye leather today, and then tomorrow we are going to dye the color For Now. It's called For Now. It looks like this. I will pop it up on the screen. It's beautiful, it's brand new, but I thought it would be a great pairing with these two colors. So, okay, we got some work to do. Okay, so I've decided that in addition to my sourdough starter, I'm also going to bake a loaf of Irish soda bread. I love Irish soda bread. It's a great breakfast bread. It's not, I mean, it's kind of crumbly and really crusty, not really the best sandwich bread, but really good for just like eating a nice slice of toast with butter on it in the morning. I like my Irish soda bread to have raisins in it, and so I'm planning on making it with raisins. So I found a recipe. Actually, my husband shared this recipe with me. It's World's Best No Yeast Bread Irish Soda Bread by Recipe Tin Eats. It's right here. I'll link to this down below if you're interested. The only thing is that it says you need buttermilk, which I don't have on hand. Now we could go to the store and grab a thing of buttermilk. I'm sure that they still have buttermilk in stock, but it says a really easy substitute for buttermilk is just, or a really easy way to make your own buttermilk is just to mix vinegar and milk together and allow it to curdle, and or lemon juice. You can use lemon juice, and the acid in the vinegar or the lemon juice helps activate the baking soda that you're going to use in the bread to create your leavening agent. So I'm thinking that's what I'm going to do. I don't know exactly how long you have to leave the buttermilk with the acid to get it to curdle. It says, okay, it says 1 cup of buttermilk equals 1 tablespoon white vinegar plus enough milk to measure 1 cup, or 1 tablespoon lemon juice plus enough milk to measure 1 cup. And so, let's see. How to substitute. The simplest way to substitute buttermilk is to pour 1 tablespoon of vinegar into a 1 cup measure and then fill the rest of the measuring cup with milk. Then gently stir the mixture and let it sit for about 5 minutes. If you don't have vinegar, lemon juice and cream of tartar also work as a great buttermilk substitute. Use them in the same way described above. Okay, so that's pretty easy. So that would give me 1 cup of buttermilk, and then the recipe I'm looking to make requires... My boys are eating lunch right now. Okay, so my recipe requires 2 cups of buttermilk, so I'm going to need to do 2 tablespoons of lemon juice to make 2 cups of buttermilk. So that's what I think I'm going to do. Otherwise, I think this is pretty easy. I have wholemeal flour, I have whole wheat flour, I have white flour, I have baking soda, I have salt, and I will then have buttermilk. So I think it's going to be easy to make buttermilk, babe. And it only has to sit for 5 minutes. All right.